He began life gathering splintered kindling on the windswept plains of Khorasan, a boy whose only inheritance was perpetual hunger. Yet, less than 40 years later, he wore the Peacock Throne, commanded an army of 200,000 soldiers, and carried the legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond out of a conquered Delhi. The story seems impossible, a leap too vast to comprehend. A slave boy turned conqueror. How does a life like that even happen? It's a tale of impossible odds, of an ambition so ruthless it bordered on elemental, and of a world that was ripe and ready for the taking. In 1688, Persia looked mighty on maps, but beneath, a beautiful, decadent illusion. Beneath its famed tiles and turquoise domes, the Safavid dynasty was rotting from within, a gilded cage holding only decay. The reigning Shah, Sultan Hussein, preferred the solace of poetry to the tedious paperwork of governance, leaving the empire vulnerable and adrift. This weakness was a siren call to its enemies. Afghan clans pushed from the east, Ottoman artillery pressed from the west, and Russian envoys circled like buzzards. Into this cracked and crumbling empire, Nader arrived, the son of a humble coatmaker in an Afshar Turkmen tent. There was no palace, no tutors, no silver spoon, just goats, wool, and the constant move for pasture. It was a harsh beginning in a tumultuous world, forging a man who would soon reshape history with fire and steel. Life offered few comforts and taught even fewer lessons in mercy. At the tender age of 13, his father died, leaving Nader to fend for himself and his mother in a world that had no safety net. By 15, he was a fixture in the local bazaar, selling scavenged firewood. His young shoulders stooped with the burden of putting food on their meager table. Then, tragedy struck with the force of a physical blow. At 17, raiding Uzbeks swept through their lands, dragging Nader and his mother into the horror of captivity. His mother perished in the filth of a dusty slave pen, a fate Nader refused to accept for himself. Fueled by a ferocious primal will to live, he escaped. He then walked 300 grueling miles back home, only to find himself starving and utterly alone once more. Desperate, he enlisted as a musketeer for a local governor. Gunpowder, you see, doesn't care about bloodlines. It only rewards sharp reflexes and unwavering nerve. Nader possessed both in spades. Within months, he was drilling recruits. Within years, he was leading raids against Afghan supply columns, learning that a swift, savage attack often ends the fight before it truly begins. These early brutal lessons forged his formidable strategic acumen. The year 1722 marked Persia's absolute nadir. In a stunning blow to the empire's prestige, Afghan rebels seized Isfahan, the magnificent Safavid capital, forcing Shah Sultan Hussein to shamefully abdicate. Persia, to all intents and purposes, flatlined. Its heart had stopped beating. For most, this spelled utter disaster and the end of an era. For Nader, it was a once-in-a-lifetime invitation. While others mourned the collapse of a centuries-old dynasty, he saw only a gaping power vacuum. He began recruiting from the fringes of society, hardened shepherds, disgruntled deserters, and opportunistic bandits, promising them something revolutionary for the time: regular pay, paid promptly in captured loot. He then strategically swore loyalty to the exiled prince, Tahmasp II, the last legitimate heir to the Safavid throne. Nader swiftly restored crucial border fortresses, and suddenly, he looked like the only patriot capable of saving the fractured realm. The prince, desperate and out of options, handed him an army. Nader, in turn, handed the prince a string of stunning victories. The momentum became unstoppable. His campaigns soon settled into a terrifyingly efficient routine, a blueprint for conquest. It began with a lightning-fast march that outpaced all intelligence, followed by a cunning night encirclement that trapped his foes while they slept. At first light, a devastating dawn artillery barrage would shatter their morale, leading to their inevitable surrender by lunchtime. Nader hammered the Afghans at every river crossing and mountain pass between Herat and Kermanshah. In 1729, he didn't just chase them back into their own mountains. He kept going, relentlessly pushing until he recaptured Isfahan amidst ecstatic crowds who hailed him as a liberator. Next, with barely a pause to rest his troops, he pivoted northwest, slugging it out with the formidable Ottomans. He systematically won back Tabriz, Hamadan, and even laid siege to Baghdad, restoring Persia's lost territories one bloody victory at a time. State chroniclers, scrambling to keep up, started calling him the Sword of Persia. The nickname stuck, not least because no one wanted to find themselves on the cutting edge of Nader's legendary wrath. Tahmasp II, the supposedly restored monarch, remained technically in charge, but he was a ghost in his own palace, a mere figurehead rattling around in the halls of power. The real authority was clear to everyone. The new coins being minted bore Nader's stern face, and soldiers sang his name, not the Shah's, in their marching songs. The power dynamic was undeniable and unsustainable. In 1732, Nader quietly and unceremoniously exiled the prince. He then installed the infant Abbas III as a puppet ruler, allowing him to govern as regent with absolute authority. 4 years later, arguing that a fractured Persia needed a single decisive monarch, he assembled the powerful tribal chiefs on the vast Mogan plain. He politely asked if they agreed with his assessment, listened with a knowing smile as they roared their choreographed approval, and then, without further ado, crowned himself Nader Shah. The shepherd's boy now sat on a throne of gold and turquoise, clutching a scepter once owned by revered Shahs. It was a complete, audacious, and masterful transformation. The acquisition of absolute power did not mellow him. If anything, it stripped away any remaining restraint and sharpened his already cruel edges. Taxes rose precipitously across the land, bleeding his subjects dry to fund his insatiable military machine. Those who dared to criticize this policy simply vanished, their absence a chilling warning to others. When his own eldest son, Reza Kohli, dared to whisper about showing mercy, a challenge to his authority in Persian court culture, Nader had him blinded, a brutal, paranoid, and preventative measure against any future coups. Yet, the very same iron will that crushed all dissent also forged the largest and most powerful Persian army since antiquity. He assembled cavalry from Azerbaijan, deadly Jezailchi marksmen from Khorasan, and camel-mounted Zamburak artillery into an empire-wide killing machine of 200,000 men, all meticulously assembled and ruthlessly efficient. This was a ruler who prioritized strength above all else, and his people paid the staggering price in both blood and treasure. In 1739, Nader, whose ambition could never be satisfied, turned his gaze east. He led his massive army on a daring march, stormed the formidable Khyber Pass, and descended upon the plains of India like a desert hawk spotting its prey. The target was Delhi, the heart of the crumbling but fabulously wealthy Mughal Empire. In just one day of brutal, decisive combat at the Battle of Karnal, he shattered the much larger Mughal army and seized enough wealth to fund his government for an entire decade. The loot was the stuff of legend, glittering jewels, magnificent elephants, mountains of gold bullion, and the famous Peacock Throne itself, which he dismantled and carried back to Persia. The legendary Koh-i-Noor diamond, which would later become a crown jewel of Britain, began its long and storied global voyage tucked away in his saddlebag. He left the city smoldering, but largely intact. After all, a dead goose lays no golden eggs. It was a raid of unprecedented scale, cementing his reputation as the wealthiest and most fearsome conqueror of his age. This overwhelming victory, however, bred an insidious paranoia that ate him from the inside out, a poison for which there was no antidote. Sleep became an elusive luxury. He reportedly woke screaming at shadows in his tent, ordered sudden midnight executions based on fleeting suspicions, and came to trust no cook but his own long-dead mother. This growing instability radiated outwards. Rebellions, sparked by his tyranny and crushing taxes, flared across his vast empire like dry grass catching fire. He stamped them out with a scorched earth brutality that beggared belief, making grim displays of his enemies' skulls as a warning and alienating even his most loyal generals. By 1747, while camped near Kachan, the nightmare he had created for others finally came for him. Assassins, most likely his own desperate officers who saw no other way out, plunged their daggers into the man who had once considered himself untouchable. A reign born of fire, ended, fittingly, in blood. Nader Shah never built lasting institutions or a stable bureaucracy. His focus was always on the next battle, the next conquest, not the mundane work of governance. He was a violent storm that passed over the land, not a foundation upon which to build a new future. But in his fury, he stitched Persia back together when it was falling to pieces, proving that raw genius and willpower can, for a time, outrun pedigree. He reminded every would-be conqueror of a timeless truth, that empires built solely on fear, while they may shine with a terrifying brightness, inevitably burn fast and consume themselves. Subscribe, because next week we're covering Ottomans and the massacre of Greeks in Asia Minor, another story of power, betrayal, and conquest you won't believe. So, next time you gather kindling for a campfire, remember, one boy who did the same rose from those ashes seized a crown and carved his name across the face of Asia. Nader Shah, the last great slave-born conqueror.